the zone is more relevant now than it ever has been. The future of medicine, I think, is going to be our ability to control our genes under dietary control.
Hello and welcome to the Wellness Zone podcast. I'm Mary Perry and I'm here with Dr. Barry Sears, and this marks a special episode for us on the Wellness Zone podcast. Why? Because we're marking a major milestone in the history of health, wellness, and nutrition. 30 years ago, a little old book called The Zone came out and hit store shelves. And while you would say it wasn't an overnight success, it really did revolutionize the way people think about nutrition and hormonal response. So Dr. Sears, you became kind of a celebrity when The Zone first came out.
Completes the titles of diet books by Dr. Barry Sears. Patrick.
What is The Zone?
Zone, you double your score.
How about The Zone? Thought you were serious about this.
I am. Just as soon as I finish this nougat caramel pretzel devil thing.
You really are a fat bastard. You know, that hurts my feelings. I tried going on a diet, you know. The Zone. You know, carbs are the enemy.
I think the other thing people don't realize is that this wasn't written to be a diet book, and you'll talk a little bit more about that, but it really is about sort of this sweet spot or this zone where you're controlling your hormones and inflammation using the right balance of macronutrients. So, Dr. Sears, why do you think this book was so revolutionary for people?
Well, one, it basically was the first, quote, diet book or nutrition book that actually talked about science. In fact, it probably talked a little too much about science, but the fact is it was the first to explore how we could use diet, the food we eat, to change the expression of our genes. And that's a pretty powerful statement. And so The Zone was really not the book per se, but really the opening chapter of a continuing book, as we understand more about metabolism, of how we can use our diet to control it, and by controlling it, control our future.
So Dr. Sears, looking back over the past 30 years, what was really your inspiration for writing The Zone?
Well, the inspiration was really the 1982 Nobel Prize in Medicine. And that was awarded for understanding how a group of hormones, little known at the time, called eicosanoids, controlled inflammation. And that sparked my interest because before then I was in the area of cancer drug delivery. It had nothing to do with hormones or basically diet. But it said if you can use the diet to control these hormones, you may be able to control virtually every chronic disease. Now, from that point, when my light bulb went off, to actually getting the concept of the zone was a 13-year journey. And it was not a straightforward pathway. It was basically a lot of hits and misses, but eventually I was able to understand how to control inflammation, patent it as a drug, and then basically begin to experiment in human beings.
Mm-hmm. So kind of looking at this pathway for the hits or misses, you know, what were sort of the events that led you up to writing The Zone?
Well, again, going back in time, people always ask, why do we get sick? Good question. Now, the fact is, why? It says, yeah, it probably has to do something of inflammation. This is known in ancient Roman times. But actually, what was it? What caused it? And how to turn off? That was still basically a secret. And this is why I got a bee in my bonnet in 1982, that the answer could be the diet, but treating it as if it were a drug.
What about you? You spent a good amount of your career before The Zone really working with elite athletes. So can you talk a little bit about how you took all of this information from the Nobel Prize and then really put it into practice working with, you know, people and athletes?
Well, first of all, it took me about 10 years to understand basically how to put together a system. And in many ways, this occurred in 1989 in the basement of the MIT library. It's kind of like Doc Brown, basically discovering the flux capacitor. And once I had it, say, that's it. I said, okay, now let's test it out. Well, who are you going to test it out on? Rats? No. They're hard to basically get feedback. How about humans? But say, let's deal with humans who live in a world of inflammation by choice, and those are elite athletes. And so I started working with elite athletes, usually triathletes or professional football players, and eventually started working with the Stanford Swim Team. Now, the thing that characterizes elite athletes, they're very disciplined, but they also live in a world of inflammation by choice. So again, I say if I'm going to make mistakes, let's make a world-class athletes. I'm less likely to kill them. And the end result was in every sport we looked at, especially swimming, that we were seeing dramatic results, really culminating in the 1992 Olympics when the Stanford swimmers won 7 gold medals. Pretty good for one country, extraordinary for one university. And so once I figured out I'm not going to kill anybody, then I said, okay, let's begin to apply this to people who are living in a world of inflammation, not by choice, but by disease. And that took another couple of years to basically find our way through there. And then we had at least a matrix, but we still didn't have a book yet.
So taking all the research and work that you did with the elite athletes, how did the Zone book come to be?
Again, purely serendipity. My wife, who's a newspaper editor, was doing diets for doctors I was working with, and one of their patients happened to be basically an editor at HarperCollins. And she called me up one day and said, do you want to write a book? I said, Judy Garland and Mickey Rooney, why not? So I wrote the first draft of the Zone, had my wife take a look at it, and she said, you gotta be kidding. Nobody can understand this stuff. So she took her pen and pencil out and said, let's make some corrections here and there and make it more understandable for somebody with an IQ of about, 143. So that was the beginning of the Zone. I took it to the editor. I said, here's a book. And she says, okay, this is pretty technical, but, I know it works. However, she didn't like the title. The title of the book was The Therapeutic Zone, just as we describe a drug. So she took a red pen out, crossed out the word therapeutic, and said, we'll call it the Zone, and let's hope we can sell a couple hundred copies. And basically that was a start. Now, HarperCollins, very, very big publishing company, sent me on book tours, and the first year, no one bought a book. I said, this doesn't make sense. They're thinking this is a diet book. It's not. It's a clarion call for basically a new revolution of how to control inflammation and live longer and live better. So I said, okay, I know nothing about publicity, so I'll try it myself. So in kind of desperation, I went to a friend of mine who basically had a radio talk show in LA that talked only about religious subjects. I said, can you put me on your show? He said, I can, however, I never talk about nutrition. I always talk about religion and philosophy. And if we don't get any calls in the first 15 minutes, I got to take you off. I said, I'm just happy for the opportunity. Well, 3 hours later, I was still on the show. And a week later, the book became #1 in the LA Times best-selling list. And a month later, it became #1 in the New York Times. So it wasn't for that basically small radio show in LA, I would not be here today.
And Dr. Sears, you ended up selling more than 6 million copies of the book. Why was it so different than other books at that time that might have focused on nutrition and diet?
Well, because it talked about hormones. Hormones are powerful things. Up to that point, most diet books were like the old Miller Lite commercials. Tastes great, less filling. So again, for the first time, there's really a new aspect to say, maybe there's some science in terms of nutrition. And this would basically struck a chord. Because this is now, we're talking about the genetic revolution, and people are saying, I'm kind of interested, this science might be more applicable than we thought in the past. So I happened to be poised at the right time when the science was emerging, and also basically the disgust of people saying, what's the best diet? The drinking man's diet was not one of the best choices, but it was a bestseller.
So, and when you look now at what the Zone diet is, the diet itself really hasn't changed much over the past 30 years, but you really have evolved with the science. So can you talk a little bit about how the concept of the Zone has changed over the years, or even sort of highlighting each of the books that you've had along the way and what they focused on building on the original concept of the Zone?
Well, the concept of the Zone is basically using diet, and that becomes your primary tool to keep hormones in a zone. Not too high, but not too low. Now, what that really means now, some 30 years later, is also keeping our genes, turning genes on and off and keeping them in a zone. Now, along the way, other things I basically discovered and wrote books about were the role of omega-3 fatty acids. They basically make the diet work better. The role of polyphenols. They make the diet work better. And so when you combine all three of those, you get this concept, what I call metabolic engineering. How 3 separate dietary factors can be working as a team to change the expression of your genes. And that's a powerful statement. No drugs can do that, but basically the diet can, but the rules haven't changed in 20 million years and are unlikely to change tomorrow. And so basically it's articulating those rules and saying it's not that hard, but you have to be consistent. Again, like drugs, they work when you use them. And the zone concept works when you use it correctly.
So would you say metabolic engineering is the next chapter of the zone, Dr. Sears?
It is because, again, like I said, the zone is basically understanding how to keep everything within limits. And so we start out keeping the hormones in the blood within limits. Now we're keeping the turning on and off of genes in every cell in your body. And you've got 30 trillion of them also within those limits. And if you can do that, then the metabolism runs like a Ferrari. If you don't, basically bad things happen.
So Dr. Sears, when the zone first debuted, you had critics that said it was too scientific, too complicated, too hard to follow, but the public really saw it as revolutionary, and it wouldn't have landed on the New York Times bestseller if it wasn't. So what do you think is the difference between what the public saw in the book versus the critics?
Well, for the first aspect, the public said, those who used the program said, my God, it works just like you predicted. That's what science does. It basically allows you to see the future. But the critics say, no, my old ways are better. They're saying, yeah, but something's happening in my body. So again, you had the performance, but again, part of their aspects where it's true. It is hard. Make no question about it. It's like being good. It's really hard in today's world. And so there are problems relative to basic compliance, and that was one of the aspects of now developing new dietary tools to make it easier and easier for individuals to comply with the concepts first laid out in the zone 30 years ago. And now we have a much greater panoply of dietary tools to work with that make it far easier to get in the zone and stay there. So that, again, you're looking at people who are not scientifically astute, but saying, something is telling me this is right. And I've been very fortunate for the last 30 years that basically I keep on writing books to keep exploring it, and people say, yeah, that makes sense, and begin to apply it to their diet.
So, Dr. Sears, why now do you think the zone is even more relevant than ever? I would say that the health of the nation was in a far different place in the 90s when you wrote this versus now. So why do you think for people, like, the zone really should be something that everybody should be following?
Well, part of it is we've abdicated our future to the drug companies. But our future really belongs in terms of food, not food basically as nutrients, but food changing the expression of our genes. That's a powerful statement. Drugs can't do that. So the fact is you have a powerful interest saying, don't worry what you eat. We have a drug that if you take it will solve all of your problems. People are finally saying that basically is a pipe dream that just isn't coming true. So I think it's more relevant than ever because we're seeing basically the limitations of drugs. So in many ways, I look at the zone as really the continuation of the work started with Louis Pasteur some 150 years ago. Now, Louis Pasteur was a great chemist, but he's also had a practical bent. And he took his chemistry background and basically helped local producers of wine and vinegar in France understand why their products were going bad. He said, germs. And everybody laughed at him and said, Louis, you're the greatest chemist in all of Europe. You know nothing about germs. There are no such things, germs. It's bad ether. And so he fought for his entire life to say, yeah, I think these little microorganisms are basically not only making the wine go bad and your beer go bad, but it's making your body go bad. And that started the germ theory. And he had to fight tooth and nail for his entire life to get that finally accepted. So I look in many ways the zone as being really the successor of the germ theory, not looking at things external to our body that cause us to get sick, but things we are basically doing internally to our body by the food we eat that are causing our metabolism not to work effectively. Drugs were an intermediary, but basically they've run their course. The future of medicine, I think, is going to be our ability to control our genes under dietary control. So the zone is more relevant now than it ever has been. So that I think the future is bright. I've got a few more books that still go under my belt, but nonetheless, it's the basic aspect of the zone. Basically, it started 30 years ago. The dietary control of gene expression is more relevant today than ever before. So my job, as I go through the last years of my life, is try to accomplish as much to put into a written format and practical format, how to use our food to change the expression of our genes to live longer and live better.
And that's a noble goal, Dr. Sears. So, Dr. Sears, we've covered a lot in this podcast. I mean, 6 million books sold with the original Zone and so many books that have followed. And all these books are still in print. So if people want to read more about the concept of the Zone and really how it's evolved over the past 30 years, where can they go to read?
Well, the science of Zone does continually to evolve. And so to see that evolution, I'd go to drsears.com. But if you want to buy the products I've also invented over the years to make it easier to follow the Zone concepts, then I'd go to zoneliving.com. You need the science, but you need the practicality.
Excellent. Dr. Sears, always a pleasure talking to you. What an amazing milestone, 30 years of the Zone. And we look forward to our next conversations.
Thank you so much.